thank you very much for coming along this evening, giving up your evening. If you were with us last week, good to see you again. And for anybody who didn't manage to make last week's, there is a recording now, and it's on the FAS website and on YouTube. So feel free to go and search for that. This meeting will be recorded too, so if you want to pass it on to anybody else or you want to watch it again, then it'll be available on the FAS website. So my name's Siobhan MacDonald. I work for SAC, and we're doing this evening event on behalf of the Farm Advisory Service. So Scottish Government have funded all of these meetings, and there's lots more resources on the FAS website, so have a look. There's also an advice line which is free, so if you're ever looking for more advice, then do give it a call. And this evening we are joined by Audrey Litterick. So Audrey has oodles of experience. She used to work for SEC and is now a private consultant and works for a consultancy firm too, and has her own amazing garden. So lots of experience. This evening we'll go through a presentation, but feel free to put questions in the chat, and then I'll interrupt as we go along and get Audrey to answer. If we don't manage to answer anything, then we'll get in touch with you afterwards with follow-ups. So just put questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll try and manage those as best as possible. So I will hand over to Audrey now to say hello and to go through her presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. So tonight we've got a pretty big subject to talk about, really, composts and growing media. There's a lot to it. I'll try and not go too fast. I want to leave some space at the end for people to ask their own questions. So what we're going to cover tonight is some definitions, first of all, composts and growing media, differences between them and descriptions, a bit about composts and composting, how it actually works, how to make good composts, and what you should be using your compost for. And then we're going to go on to growing media, whether you should be trying to make it yourself or buy it, what it means to actually go peat-free, and if you're buying growing media, how to choose a good one, and if you are making it, some do's and don'ts, I suppose, some advantages and disadvantages, and some do's and don'ts. So first of all, I want to cover one of the biggest sources of confusion as far as composts are concerned, and that confusion is because in the UK we've got two completely different meanings to the word compost. And the result of that is there's a huge amount of confusion out there. We're seeing people make mistakes because they're mixing up the different types of composts. And when they're using composts for growing on young plants, if it's compost that they've made themselves in their garden, they're seeing poor germination and poor growth of young plants and a lot of heartache and crop losses and so on. So I'm going to clear up some of the confusion first of all. So first of all, let's look at what I call true compost. So by true compost, I mean a material that's made through a composting process, something that you might make in your own garden. You can get a composting process of very different scales. So some of the local authorities and also some commercial companies do composting on a very big scale, where they're taking food wastes and garden wastes and making compost out of that. But the principles of composting are pretty much the same, whether you're looking at a garden scale compost heap or heaps. I would definitely suggest heaps rather than heap, singular, is a good idea. And whether you're looking at a small system or a very big one, the principles are pretty much the same. So true compost is a stable material, is a sanitized material. In other words, it's self-heated to kill some of the things in there that we don't want, such as pests and diseases and weed seeds. So it's a stable material, it's a sanitized organic material made from organic wastes. It's rich in a wide range of good organisms, beneficial microorganisms. And this is a crucial point. It's suitable for use as a fertilizer or a soil conditioner to improve soils, maybe a top dressing for turf. Only, however, the very best ones can be used as constituents of growing media. In other words, part of the medium that you might use to sow seeds in, or to grow on young plants in. And I will speak quite a bit more about that as we go on. So that's what true compost I'm defining it as. The benefits of using compost in agriculture or in field horticulture are very well documented and well known. There's lots of benefits. So let's have a look at composting first. Composting is not an anaerobic process. In other words, it occurs with oxygen, and oxygen's absolutely crucial for a composting process. You need that oxygen for the right sort of bugs to come along, and those right sort of bugs will come along. They're there quite naturally in the environment and already on all the wastes that you might chuck into a composting process. You don't need to add anything, providing you've got the feedstocks or the starting materials, right? And providing you put the good conditions in to allow the composting process to happen. So crucially, the composting process is achieved through mixing. You've got to mix the stuff you're putting in. Aeration, you've got to allow in enough oxygen, enough air. And if you do that, you'll get, the pile will heat up. So you'll get this self-generated heating. Whatever size your compost system is, you should get some degree of self-generated heating. If you're really good at what you do, you should get quite a lot of heat being generated. And that's the point. When you've got a hot mass in the middle, you should be turning it when it's hot, so that you're allowing all the stuff on the outside to go into the inside, and it can get self-heated too. And it's that self-heating which kills the nasties. Okay. We're going to have a question for you now, to ask whether you make your own compost at present for use in your either your own business, if you're growing crops commercially on a small scale, or in your garden. Are you composting on any scale? Yes or no? Well, that's impressive. Every single person is. We get 10 out of 10 for that. Or 14 out of 14. That's fantastic. That's really good. But the word compost can also mean a growing medium in this country, and that's what creates the confusion, because a growing medium is something that you would buy out of a bag in a garden centre, but some people are now making their own growing media, either to sow seeds in or to pot on young plants into. And the problem is the UK gardening media does use both meanings for the word compost, kind of interchangeably quite often, or at least they're using the word compost frequently without defining exactly what they mean. And the result is people get the two confused. The two types of compost, the true compost that I've just described, and growing media are totally different. They are absolutely not interchangeable. So let's have a look at growing media now. Growing media are manufactured by blending several different materials or different constituents to get tailor-made products for specific end uses. So the most difficult to make for them are the media for the more sensitive subjects, things like seed sowing and cuttings, when you're trying to get cuttings to root. And then potting on younger plants, that need a little bit more fertilizer in it, a little bit less exacting to make stuff like that. And then potting on older plants. And the easiest stuff to make probably is the growing media that you'd use to grow greedy feeders, things like vegetables, for example, and potatoes in containers. And growing heaths and heathers or ericaceous stuff, that's a bit different. That needs a more acid medium. Now, what might those constituents be of growing media? Well, peat has formerly been the main bulk constituent. Peat's a great, easy thing to make growing medium out of. Unfortunately, it's still relatively cheap, but for very good environmental reasons, the use of peat is being phased out in growing media, and we're seeing people making growing media from other things. So coir, which is a waste from coconut production, that's a commonly used constituent of growing media. Composted bark, wood fibre, composted wood fibre or sterilised heat-treated fibre, and to a less extent other things like, in fact, compost, true compost. Quite often in commercially made media, it might be a PAS 100 accredited quality compost made by a commercial supplier. And then you've got other things like loam, and then sand and gravel, and maybe perlite or vermiculite, and some expanded clay minerals. Those are the sorts of things that you might see in a growing medium that you might buy. Also, you should be including these sorts of things if you're making your own, but I'll come on to that later. So it's that the physical and chemical properties of a good growing medium are critical to safety and performance. So why can't we just use our own garden compost then to sow seeds in or to grow plants in? Because they look so similar, and this is what makes the confusion. Because a growing medium, whether it's a compost that you've made yourself or a growing medium out of a bag, they look similar and they smell very similar. But garden composts are very, very variable. Depends on the feedstock, the composting process, and the weather conditions during the time that you've been doing that composting. In general, they're much too salty. They're much too nutrient rich for young developing roots. They've got a lot of ammonium nitrogen in them naturally, and that can burn young roots. And they've sometimes got a lot of woody material, a lot of high carbon material, which can limit plant growth and development. The reasons for that are a bit complicated, but that's just a fact. And generally, garden composts are physically unsuitable for use on their own. They quite often drain too quickly, or they hold too much water, in fact. It's usually one way or the other. And also, they usually do contain some degree of weed seeds and plant pests and pathogens. So it's not a good idea to use your own compost from your garden, neat, on its own, as a growing medium. So we'll have a look in more detail now at the composting process. Just to have a look at how to get it going at its absolute best. It's a very, very complicated process. And as somebody said earlier on, I think it was Siobhan, it is a bit of an art, but there's science behind that art. And the more of the science you understand, the better chance you've got of getting it to work properly. So I know some people who don't understand the composting process in terms of the science and are absolutely brilliant at it. They've worked out how to do it really, really well. But if you're new to it, it's as well to know a bit about the science so that you can work out what to do and avoid the years of pain and go straight to achieving something pretty good pretty quickly. So it's a very complicated process. It's totally done, if you like, by microorganisms, mostly bacteria and fungi. And they're there naturally on the wastes before you even start. And providing you've let enough moisture in there to the ingredients, enough air in there, and you've shredded the material enough or chopped it small enough, and you've mixed it all well through, then microorganisms will naturally produce heat as they multiply and the composting process will happen. And the heat builds up gradually and the whole lot cools down over time. And during that time, the bugs, the balance of microorganisms in there will change naturally during the process in a very predictable manner. So it's the sugar fungi or the decomposers of the easy stuff that start the process. And then as the quickly broken down green fleshy material gets broken down, then you get the wood rotting fungi moving in as the thing cools down later on. How does composting actually work? It's the natural heating in a compost pile or windrow is vital to the whole thing. And the better you are at composting, the hotter it will get, within reason. You don't need temperatures more than about 60 degrees, but that's what you're aiming for. You're aiming, if possible, to get temperatures of about 55 to 60 degrees plus, maybe up to about 70. Because if you get temperatures like that, and then you can turn the whole lot so that all the cooler parts get into the middle, it's that heat which kills the things that you don't want to be there, like plant diseases, for example, plant pathogens, animal pathogens, human pathogens, weed seeds, and it'll denature any plant viruses that are in there, and it'll help break down anything else that you don't want to be there. If there's any pesticides in there, or even wormers present in any animal dung that you've put in, for example, or veterinary medicines present in animal dung, for example. Okay. So this is a bit of a golden rule slide. That's why I've coloured it in golden. Choosing raw materials. This tells you that the crucial 3 things that you need to think about: structure, moisture, and, well, I've called it carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we'll start with that. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is the blend of high carbon materials, which is woody, papery materials, relevant to the green, fleshy, high nitrogen materials. That balance has got to be right. Technically, you want a C to N ratio of 25 to 1 to 40 to 1. But what that basically means is you want a good blend of green, fleshy material, or things like vegetable wastes, to high carbon material, like shredded wood, for example, or chopped up bracken, or a little bit of paper. But you don't want too much paper and card, because it's very difficult then to get the structure open enough. So if you are chipping wood or shredding wood, you want to keep it reasonably open. The size of the particles of wood depends on the size of your heap or your windrow. So the very big commercial compost producers I work with, their windrows of compost, their piles of compost, are about 4 meters high, and they've shredded their wood very, very coarse. But if you're working on a small scale, then you want quite finely shredded. So a typical garden shredder, for example, might shred wood to the right size, or you can chop it using secateurs or garden shears. So you've got to have it open enough to let water penetrate in, and more importantly, probably air. And then down the bottom, you want a moisture content of about 40 to 60%. Well, that's kind of done by feel, really. You want some moisture in there, but not too much. So if there's too much, it'll sit in a soggy mess. If there's not enough, it just won't compost. It'll just sit there. So that's the most important set of things. So if anybody's got any questions about that, they can ask me, but we must move on just now. On their own, most feedstocks are not actually ideal. So fleshy, wet, green material or dung on its own, for example, will not work well. There's too much nitrogen in there, not enough air. It needs mixed with chunky, woody material. Just woody materials on their own are not great either. They need mixed with high nitrogen material, and they probably need a bit of water as well. But one of the greatest things is that if you've got a natural mix in your garden, which I certainly do, of hedge clippings, vegetable wastes, grass clippings, that mixed together is pretty much perfect. And similarly, the blend of stuff that comes into a commercial site from lots of people's gardens is usually that perfect mix as well. So maybe a bit too much grass clippings in the summer, maybe a little bit too much woody material in the winter, but not bad. Okay. So you absolutely need to be able to put in a bit of time and effort. Making good compost does not generally happen by accident. I used to be a bit lackadaisical, but now I've got my better half takes the time to turn our compost twice, I think, during its 1 year life. And that, plus the garden shredder, has made all the difference. We make top quality compost in 1 year. It does get hot. You can stick a temperature probe, a compost thermometer, into the middle of it and find out what sort of temperatures you're getting. And it is wise to choose the start materials carefully. Use a blend of stuff and mix it well together. If you're in the west of Scotland, your compost will probably sit too wet and it might need covered. If you're in the east of the country, it's probably the other way around, and you may end up in some parts of the year having to water it. And if it gets really soggy at the bottom, which sometimes ours does, you need to mix it all through. And that's quite a lot of work, which is why it's a good idea to have 3 compost heaps. One that you're making, an empty one for it to turn into, and one where it's maturing. So you've got to make sure enough air gets in, but not too much. If your wastes are too coarse, you really do need to shred them. And as I've said, turn, I would say, at least twice. Most people can't manage more than twice. A commercial composter will be making compost in 8 weeks, potentially. And if you're really good at what you're doing on a big scale, 8 weeks is absolutely possible. But on a garden scale, I would look at least 6 months with a couple of turns. We do ours for a year with a couple of turns. And for many applications, for example, if you are going down the growing media route, you might need to sieve the compost before you're using it. And I certainly do that. I sieve it twice, once through a 1 centimetre sieve and then once through a 0.5 centimetre sieve before using it in growing media. Okay. So what can you use the compost for then? Well, it is a fantastic fertilizer. And it's the kind of fertilizer that doesn't supply nutrients for lazy plants to take up. It basically feeds the soil. It's feeding the microorganisms, and they need to be doing the breaking down, further breaking down of that compost in the soil into the kind of very simple forms of nutrients which the plants can take up. So it's a very good source of particularly phosphate, potash, magnesium, sulfur, and trace elements. It's a great soil conditioner. It's a fantastic organic matter booster. You can also use it as a top dressing if it's sieved. The coarse bits can be used as a mulch around orchard trees to help keep weeds down, for example. It can also be used as a constituent of growing media, and that's what we're going to cover shortly. Okay, so next poll question is, do you buy bags of compost and growing media, or well, let's call them bags of growing media to sow seeds in and pot on young plants, or do you make your own? Okay. So most people are being very sensible and they buy bags of I'll call them growing media. They're buying bags of growing media. But there are 4 out of 18 of you are doing a bit of a mix. And I'm now using a bit of a mix. I have to say that's not always been the case. So let's have a look at growing media now. What to consider? Well, what do you need it for? That's the first question. So are you looking to sow seeds in it? That's mainly why I buy growing media. I'm now not buying very much at all for potting on young plants. I'm trying to make my own. Multi-purpose growing media are always a bit of a compromise. Some are a pretty good compromise, but some of the ones I've used this year, the peat-free and reduced peat multi-purpose ones, have been not to put too fine a point on it, awful. Until very, very recently, I was advising small-scale growers to just be extremely careful and not feel too guilty if they were using peat-based compost or reduced peat media, because the quality just was not there in some of the bought-in peat-free ones. That is beginning to change. And then there's loam-based media as well. Some people prefer to use what's called John Innes composts or John Innes growing media, which have got peat in them. The traditional ones have got a mix of sterilised loam and some peat and some sand and some fertilizers. But some of the modern John Innes ones, they're calling them John Innes, but there's actually coir in them rather than peat. You really need to consider the quality of what you're buying. It's absolutely crucial whether you're growing veg just for your own family and friends, or whether you're actually taking some money making some money out of it. It's really, really vital to have a reliable, good quality growing medium for your seeds. So about 2 years ago, I stupidly followed the advice of a friend, plus my own ideas to be environmentally friendly, and I used a particular brand of peat-free media for all my seed sowing, and it was disastrous. I lost everything in that 1 year. And of course, you can't really catch up because it's 5 or 6 weeks before you decide this growing medium is complete rubbish, by which time you should be getting ready to plant something in your garden, plant all your veg in your garden, and you can't because you haven't got any. So I was scrabbling around sort of begging transplants off of friends from here, there, and everywhere. So if it's very important to get that seed sowing compost or seed sowing growing medium right. If possible, try it first on a small scale if you've got time to do that. That's what I do now. I would never make that same mistake again. So try it first on a small scale if you can, by growing something quick growing, like a cress seed, for example, or rocket or mustard or something, and try to see that it's doing what you think it's going to do. Or the other thing you can do is look at the Which guide. Gardening Which compares a whole range of the perhaps the more the bigger companies' products, and it's a good scientifically set out trial, and you can get some good results from that. You might also be interested in sustainability. I am, but the most important thing for your seed sowing is just to get something that works. So that sort of trumps all the other considerations for the seed sowing stage. Reputation, it's not always easy to get that, but it's worth asking around to see what media is getting a good reputation this year. And this year might be different to last year. A lot of these suppliers are not making consistent quality between years. And certainly for your seed sowing and your young plants, be prepared to pay for something that actually works. Cheap is not good if your plants are simply not thriving. Okay. So why should you go peat-free? Well, peat's a finite resource. It's impossible for us to use it sustainably at the rate we're using it. It's a very sensible thing to be moving forward and trying to use media that don't have peat. There are now some very good peat-free media. The challenge is just finding them amidst the dross, and believe me, there is a lot of dross in particularly the peat-free growing media world, and particularly amateur products. And the other thing is we've got to get used to it, because peat's about to be banned. Well, peat has theoretically been banned in England in growing media, and a lot of the garden centres no longer, even in Scotland, no longer sell peat-based or even reduced peat media. So just a matter of interest, if you do buy in your growing media, do you use peat-based, reduced peat, or peat-free? That's very interesting. Most of you are now moving towards peat-free. So I'll be interested to hear later on in the questions who's enjoying that and finding it dead easy, and other people might not be having quite such an easy time of it. So most people are going entirely peat-free now, which is great. Making peat-free growing media is difficult, though. It's a lot more difficult for commercial companies than making a peat-based medium was. And the reason for that is peat used to be the entire bulk of a growing medium. And it was a blank canvas. There was no nutrients in it. It was acid, so you knew you had to add lime, and it was pretty much sterile. And you were able to get good physical properties from peat from different bogs for different purposes. But there is no one constituent can entirely replace it. Possibly apart from coir in some cases, but coir's got its own problems. It's in very short supply, and it's not always all that sustainable. It comes from the other side of the world. So it's much more difficult to make peat-free media, either yourself or the companies do find that too. And unfortunately, the products, many of them on the amateur market, are very inconsistent between years, and also sometimes even in the same year. So basically, growing media manufacturers are now having to do a lot more testing, which is very expensive, in order to make sure that their products are consistent. And most of them just can't afford to do that. Most growing media companies for the amateur situation, the amateur market, are simply not spending enough money. And they say that is because people are not prepared to pay the full price of growing media. And let's face it, growing media has probably doubled in price over the last 5 years as it is. But I'm doing a lot of testing on some of my projects and finding it's costing me about £300 a test for one test for all the things that you need to do to make sure that a growing medium is as good as it needs to be. So it is expensive. So there's an acute shortage as well of good quality constituents, and that's gradually becoming chronic. So a lot of manufacturers are using poorer quality constituents than they should do. Okay. So for those of you who are using reduced peat and peat-free growing media, which is most of you, even the very best types have got to be used with care. And you've got to recognise that they're going to behave differently. That was my biggest problem, first of all. Many new users to these peat-free media find the watering at least different, if not difficult. The media quite often look dry when in fact it's wet lower down. Watering is a more skilled job, especially if you're growing in module trays. And reduced peat and peat-free growing media are also heavier, a lot heavier. And that means that the bags are smaller, so you're getting less for your money. Okay. Right, I'd be interested to see what you're saying here. Have you ever felt that the quality of the bagged compost or growing media that you've bought is poor? And nobody's saying excellent. No, I'm afraid I wouldn't ever say excellent either. Okay, that's a few of you okay. A few of you saying mediocre, a few of you saying poor, and some saying getting worse. Yeah. Unless you really have come upon a company that you feel has got it absolutely right, I think some cases it is getting worse. Okay. So how do you make sure that you're going to get a good start for your growing? Good quality growing media is absolutely crucial. Because all your propagation is going to depend on it, particularly at the start. So don't assume that a brand that worked for you last year will be as good next year. Unfortunately, I found that to my cost this year. I'm doing lots of trials at the moment, so I didn't trip myself up, but I assumed one of the big brands would be as good as it was last year, and it absolutely was not. And some of the smaller brands also have been very, very poor. So ask around friends and colleagues, discuss with other people what they've used, what they're using this year. And it is worth getting the gardening which recommendations, which I think come out in November or December every single year for the following year. And it's really a good idea to take the time to test what you're considering using first. Your medium can look great, but you'll never be aware of any chemical problems until too late. And by then you've lost several weeks of growing season. So here's the things that go wrong. It can be too acid or too alkaline, more like too alkaline. The really big problems are too much saltiness, and that burns developing roots. So the seedlings barely get off the ground and then they die. Too much ammonium, that's another common thing to cause the same thing, death of seeds and seedlings. Another really big problem is carbon to nitrogen ratio too high. That means that the microorganisms that are present, and they always are, there were none you see in peat, which is pretty much sterile. But all the alternatives are full of microorganisms, most of them goodies, occasionally some baddies as well. But these microorganisms are constantly breaking down the growing medium. And if there's not enough nitrogen in there, then the bugs are an awful lot better at getting what's there than your plant roots are. So that's why that property results in a poor medium, or a lack of excess of one or more nutrients as well, and also presence of plant pathogens. That's a more common problem, I would say. So if you're going to make your own, you really are determined, try to do it first on a very small scale, and try your medium out carefully with a few species against a couple of good, or what you think are likely to be good, commercially available media. See how good yours is compared with the competition, in other words. And consider in the first stages just using your own homemade stuff, just for maybe the easier jobs like growing on vegetables and tubs and troughs with flowers in and so on. Okay. And the next point is, if you are going to make your own, you cannot make it purely from your own garden compost. You've got to dilute it with some, I suppose, some less nutrient-rich materials. Monty Don's got a good recipe on his website, which is, I think it's something like 40% your own sieved garden compost, 40% coir, which is an imported material. So if you're not too bothered about importing material and you're happy to buy the coir, that's a good way to do it. And then mix it with a bit of loam, which you can sterilize if you want. I've got ideas on that, but anyway, and coarse river sand, washed coarse river sand, not salty sea sand, but river sand. So I use leaf mold instead of imported coir, but that's quite hard to make. Mine's about 10 years old and it needs to be sieved first. Okay, so the third point is watch your young plants in modules or in trays, watch them carefully and be ready to do things differently, whether that be particularly in relation to watering. You might need a bit less water, and also feeding. Watch if they start to look pale and wobbly and try and think, do I need to be giving this a bit more feed? And be ready to use liquid feeds as the season goes on. And lastly, I think, if your early experiments go well and you start to decide, I'm going to go for the seed sowing, I'm going to try and make media for that, then do test every batch that you make on a small scale before risking using it a bit more widely. Okay, to conclusions then. So true composts made from garden waste through a well-run composting process, they're super valuable in the garden. Everybody should be doing it, and it looks like all of you guys are, which is great. But they're very different from growing media, which are, of course, also called composts. If you understand the differences between the two types, then you can start learning how to absolutely get the best out of the growing media, compost used in growing media, and your business or your garden or your croft is going to be much the better for it. Okay, so Siobhan's just put up the slide there showing where you can get some more information. There's quite a good web page on the RHS website about peat-free growing media. It's much better than it was, a lot more informative. And there's some good information on the FAST website. And also there's a handbook for crofters, which you can get off the Scottish Crofting Federation for website. It's needing updated, if I'm perfectly honest, but it's there in a bit more detail. Over to you, Siobhan, to master the questions session.
Excellent, thank you very much. Before we go on to questions, and just put your questions in the chat, or if you want to ask them out loud, raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can just chat. We've got a feedback form that we'll send out to you afterwards, just to see what you think of these webinars and what you'd like more of or less of. The good thing about these is that there is a prize draw. So if you fill out your feedback form, you're entered into a prize draw. And since we've only had 2 meetings this month, there's a good chance that somebody doing horticulture will win. So definitely fill that out. It'll be emailed to you afterwards. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll go to some of our questions. So one of the questions is about wormeries. What about using wormeries to make compost or indeed growing media?
Worm compost is totally different. It's one type of compost that I've not covered in this webinar. Basically, worm compost, or vermicompost as it's quite often called, is not what I would call a true compost. That's not knocking it, it's just not made through mixing, self-generated heating and aeration. So it's basically all passed through the gut of an earthworm. So it's a bit more like an anaerobic digestate than a compost. It's not had any, so that the advantages of it is extremely nutrient rich. If the worms have been well fed, then it's extremely nutrient rich. It's kind of a slightly gooey and slimy, so it wouldn't have the right properties on its own to be used as a growing medium. What else can I say about it? The other thing about it, apart from the fact it's a fantastic fertilizer and soil conditioner, the other thing about it is because it's not been made through self-generated heating, you get all sorts of stuff in it, including weed seeds and plant pathogens. So it's not sterile. Personally, I wouldn't use it ever as a constituent of growing medium for that reason. It tends to not, as I say, be sterile, and it's just a bit too nutrient rich to be used in a growing medium, in my experience. But it's almost a waste, to be honest, to use it as a growing medium. It's a phenomenal soil conditioner. So there's something a little bit magical about vermicompost that we don't really fully understand. I think there's probably some plant hormones in it and things, so that when you use it, and you would be using it at very low rates, because I say it can be a bit like poultry manure. It can be very, very strong, but when you're using it in vegetable production, you would put it on at fairly low rates, but sometimes you get more growth in your vegetables than you expect, which is why I think there might be plant hormones in it. It's great stuff, but it's kind of one of the best ways of breaking down household food waste residues.
Okay, that's grand. How do you sterilize loam?
Well, I don't. But you can still, I've done it. And the reason, the way I do it would be moisten it until it's really quite moist, and then lay it out in flat trays, baking trays actually, and stick it in your oven. I just feel very uncomfortable about microwaving soil. So I bake it in the oven for about 10 minutes, about 200 degrees Celsius. Now that's probably overkill. The reason I don't sterilize loam, and it is very contentious, but my experiences so far are that I'm all right with this. The reason I don't sterilize loam is because if your soil comes from the right place, and this is really crucial, if it comes from the right place, then it's liable to contain mainly goodies rather than baddies. So by that, I mean all the beneficial organisms that are naturally present in soil rather than plant pests and pathogens. And when you sterilize soil, or rather when you heat it like that, you're actually not sterilizing it. It's impossible to sterilize soil. It's impossible to sterilize any organic material, pretty much. You're effectively pasteurizing it like you would pasteurize milk. So what you're aiming to do is kill all the nasties. But unfortunately, when you kill the nasties, you'll kill a lot of the beneficial organisms too. And you don't really want to do that, particularly since all the other things that you've got, like, for example, coir, wood fiber, not so much wood fiber, coir, composted bark, leaf mold, they've got loads and loads of microorganisms in as well. Again, mainly beneficials. And there's a growing recognition now amongst plant pathologists, of which I am one, that we should be looking much more to stimulate the beneficial organisms in soils and in growing media, rather than just kill the bad things. And that's extending also to the microbiome in our own guts, in human guts and in animal guts as well. There's an increasing understanding of that, and that we're more likely to be healthy if we're stimulating the good bugs in our insides. So here's the really crucial point. So far, I've not run into problems with this, not sterilizing loam. And there's going to be somebody out there who tells me I'm mad for doing what I'm doing, but you must select loam from a place where you think it's highly unlikely to contain any pathogens. So in my growing media that I'm mixing for seed sowing for an innovative farmers project, what I'm doing is going to a place where I know there's never been any horticultural crops grown, therefore it's unlikely to have any horticultural pathogens. Going to, in particular, no turnips or rape or anything, because I don't want any clubroot. That would be a total disaster. So I'm picking it from a long-term pasture soil that's got a very species-rich flora in it. It's fairly near to a woodland, but it's not a woodland soil, so it's got no honey fungus in it. So it's very important where you get your soil. So from a healthy soil, no evidence of disease, no evidence of horticultural crops ever have been grown there. Not a woodland soil, but species-rich pasture, if you can get it. So in my case, probably shouldn't say this as well because it involves theft, but in my case, what I've done is go to a place where there's local walks. I'm only harvesting like a kilogram, in my case, of soil from a molehill. And just go along with a rucksack, just quickly take a little pot full of soil, stick it in my bag, stick it in a rucksack and take it away. Strictly speaking, of course, that's not legal, but I can't do that in my own garden because A, I've got clubroot, B, I know there's a long-term history of horticultural crops, C, I know I've got Phytophthora and raspberries. No way. I wouldn't even sterilize it because I'd be frightened of getting that wrong. So if you've got your own holding and you've not had horticultural crops on the side somewhere or where you've got sheep, perfect.
Have you ever been arrested?
No, or not for that anyway.
Not for that. Okay, so we've got a few folk asking about wool and also about bracken. So somebody has lots of bracken available to them. They'd like to use it to make compost. And they've seen that a company are selling a bracken and wool-based compost. Could they make similar compost themselves? And somebody else has asked about composting wool, if you've any experience of it or tips. So wool as a compost or wool and bracken mix.
Yeah, well, I'll start with, I'm not going to mention the company's name because we probably all know who it is. There's only one company in the UK that's making a growing medium out of wool and bracken, but they are putting a very high percentage. I don't know exactly what they do, although they're very, very nice people, with their hearts very much in the sustainability camp. But they are making a growing medium which is largely based on compost that they're producing themselves from bracken and wool. And there's very big problems with doing that. It's very, very nutrient rich. It's not great physically. However, the quality of their actual compost, as opposed to the growing media that they produce, is absolutely superb. And that's because bracken and wool make brilliant compost. Bracken and wool together make brilliant compost. They do not make a brilliant growing medium on their own, I'm afraid. You should be adding other things to it. But let's look at those two things. So bracken can be used in two completely different ways. Now, I understand what that company does is wait till it's brown, and that's what I would do. Because if you mix green bracken in, it's got a lot of nitrogen in it, and it's basically a high nitrogen waste, which is a bit like vegetable waste or fresh manure. Whereas if you wait till it's brown, you've still got all that massively rich P and K, potash and phosphorus content, but none of the nitrogen, or very little of the nitrogen, which is by that time it's gone back down into the root of the plant. So if you're harvesting when it's brown, it mixes really well with wool. Because contrary to popular opinion, wool is a very high nitrogen material. A lot of people think because it's dry, then it falls into the same sort of category as cardboard or wood. Not the case at all. So if you're looking to make a compost purely out of bracken and wool, you could do it. It would be better if there was some wood chips mixed in with it, because then you could use a lot more wool. You also wouldn't have to go to quite such hard work getting the bracken, and B, that would allow a lot more air in, which is the difficulty if you're mixing shredded bracken and wool. It's very difficult to get enough air into the mix. But I've composted wool on many occasions when I can get it, and some of the best stuff is the sort of daggy sheep's wool stuff that's clipped off the back of sheep's backsides, because it's got all that nitrogen in it from the wool and from the sheep poo, and it's a genuine waste product anyway. Mix that with brown bracken and some shredded wood, and it's a fantastic compost. feedstock or starter materials. The only thing you've got to watch is you need for that, you need to weigh it down a bit, really make sure there's plenty of water in it, and probably put something heavy on top to make sure that there's enough contact between all the materials to get them composting. Otherwise, it can just stay as a bit of a dry fluff and not do anything. But it does work really, really well. Either that on its own or mixed in with everything else.
Okay. If anyone would like to buy some daggy wool, then do get in touch. Okay. We have a question back to compost. So what are the signs, if you're making garden compost, what are the signs that confirm it's ready to be used? So that it's well composted?
Well, technically, I tend to use a kit to measure that. So it's available from a company called, we used to sell them, we don't anymore, Solvita. And that measures the stability of the compost. So basically what it's doing is it's measuring the extent to which the bugs in your compost are still breathing. So it's the amount of carbon dioxide that's evolved. But these cost about £20. And if you're using them once a year, that's not very much. The fact is, if you've done everything properly and it has heated, maybe in a couple of cycles, then you can tell by the smell and by the look. So it should be, by the time it's getting quite mature, it should still be quite moist, because you can sometimes mistake a compost that's quite dry for just being ready, but that's not necessarily the case. So it should have stayed, if it stayed moist enough throughout, then you should be able to take a handful of it, squeeze it hard, and it should all just sort of stick together, or no more than one droplet of moisture is coming out, and it should smell kind of sweet and earthy. It should never smell sort of stinky and sulphurous and rotten egg smell, because that's a sure sign that the composting has stalled and the breakdown's turned anaerobic and you're doing something wrong. The other interesting thing is, in a compost heap, if there's still big chunks in it, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the fine stuff is not stable. So I've recently made compost in an aero bin, which is a hot bin, which is an insulated sort of thing. And what we did was sieve it to get the coarse stuff out. And I was really basically doing this to prove that it wouldn't work as a growing media constituent, because the compost in this case was only 3 months old, far too young, really, normally to be putting in as a constituent of growing media. And I was doing it to demonstrate to my fellow research programmers that this is definitely not going to work. But in fact, it did work. So we sifted the compost at only 3 months old through the 1 centimetre sieve, then the 5 mil sieve, tested it for stability, and it was actually the fine stuff was actually quite stable. So all the breakdown was happening in the coarser material still. So then we mixed it with leaf mold, mixed it with coarse sand and loam, and it produced some very good seedlings. So stability of the whole lot is going to take a lot longer. But if you're desperate for compost and you want to sieve some out, sometimes it can be younger. But I would be careful in that case and test its stability and with one of these Solvita test kits. You can buy them on the internet. I'm not sure what the price is now. Or send it to a lab. Some laboratories will do it, but that'll be dearer. It's quicker to do it yourself. But you can tell a lot just by smell and feel.
Okay. Somebody's asking about using sand. So is river sand use a long-term option or an environmental concern?
If it's an environmental concern, but I mean, I'm talking about using, again, a couple of litres. So very, very small amounts. And there's, rightly or wrongly, river sand coming down my river on a regular basis in very large quantities. You might argue why that is. But the other thing you could do is actually buy sharp sand from a quarry. And obviously that's a finite resource as well. But you're looking at very small quantities.
Okay. And lots of crofters in the West and islands use sand from beaches to spread on ground as a liming agent.
Well, that's right. I'd be very careful about doing that because that's got a very powerful neutralizing value. So it might make your compost a little bit too high in pH. So that's not such a great idea because it does neutralize. You're absolutely right.
Is there a risk of New Zealand flatworm in bought-in compost? So somebody is saying that a neighbour of theirs thinks this pest arrived on her croft in a bulk load of compost.
Almost impossible. I would say that's highly unlikely. I mean, pests, well, depends where the compost was from. If it was from a commercial producer of green compost or food green compost, I just think that's almost impossible. I mean, they're getting every single system of commercial producers. If they're selling you compost, it'll be past 100 accredited, which means that they're testing it. And those composts generally reach temperatures of about 70 degrees. I'm not saying they'll not contain any diseases because clubroot is very heat tolerant and it can survive a commercial composting process. There's absolutely no way that any nematode species could, let alone something as big as a flatworm. No chance. And the chance of contamination coming in, it's almost impossible. These companies don't have anything to do with commercial plant production. Where it's much more likely to have come in on is one egg potentially on the base of a plant pot that's come from a nursery, and much more likely not a commercial nursery either. The danger places are places like these lovely Scotland's Garden Scheme open gardens. I've had an actual New Zealand flatworm on the bottom of a pot that I got from one of them, because New Zealand flatworm is endemic in a lot of the west of Scotland, and where you often find them is sitting cozy on the bottom of plant pots in cold frames, for example. So a much more likely place to have got it is somewhere like that on a bought-in plant, more likely from a small scale producer and an amateur producer or a gardener, and even a friend, unwittingly, rather than from any form of commercial production.
Okay, couple more questions. Back to bracken again. If I cut the bracken and leave it to dry out before composting, will that be the same carbon-wise as the brown bracken left to grow and harvested in the winter?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. That was a good answer. So, do you use a richer mix for potting up seedlings or the same? We use spent compost from containers, not scientific, but less nitrogen.
Yes, I do use a richer mix, but it doesn't matter all that much, providing you keep an eye on things and feed it if you see it's getting, if you see it's looking a bit poorly and looking as if it's needing fed. Just be careful if you're using, I don't have a problem with using your own previously used container mix. The only thing is, I watch out in case there's any vine weevil in it, because sometimes vine weevil grubs, you know, the wee fat, creamy coloured grubs, they can be present in that, and also sometimes plant pathogens, root pathogens. So if your containers have got wet and your plants looked poorly, then I wouldn't use it. I would just chuck it out. And I have an option. I wouldn't even put it in my compost heap if that's the case, because it's very slow to break down and it can sometimes sort of slow the whole composting process. So, but I've got an option though. I put mine for commercial composting, where it's because I get a brown bin collected every week. Not everybody does. So I put all my nasty clubroot infested roots in that, because hopefully it'll be very, very highly diluted. Actually, the really bad clubrooty stuff, I just burn it. But there's no problem in doing that. The problem can be physical. So if you're reusing container media, sometimes it can be quite broken down and therefore sit rather airless and dense. So you've got to watch that. One thing I've definitely noticed is that I'm not as good as I used to be at potting up herbaceous plants in the autumn and expecting them to be live still in the spring. I have masses more losses than I ever used to. And that's because you can't control the rainfall in a wet winter. And the growing media just collapses. It slumps much, much more than peat-based stuff does, however much bark you put in it. So if I'm going to be potting something on for long-term use, like a tree or a shrub or something like that, I would not use old container media. I'd use something new and give it the best chance. And as much woody chips in it as possible to keep it open over the winter.
Okay, that's great. So if there's any final questions, do put your hand up or shout out.
I've put my hand up. She's on.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Oh, yes.
If I may.
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask Audrey, and thanks for the hour. It's been brilliant. About hay and using hay as a feedstock. I think that's the term you used.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It works really, really well. The only thing is it tends to slump a bit, so you need to make sure that you're mixing it well with other stuff and to keep it open. And the other thing is if there's lots of seeds heads on the top of it, you will get grass weeds coming up in your growing media. So you got to be ready to tackle them. If it's I mean, I've got loads of seeds in my growing media that I'm making myself, and I'm not really bothered. Because if it's a small scale, you can pick them out. It would be unacceptable in a commercial medium. And grass weeds are a bit of a pain because you can end up getting a lot of them and they are more fiddly to pick out. But yeah, hay can work well.
Great, thank you.
The one thing which is not very good is spoiled silage. And that's because it's full of all the wrong bugs to start with. It's full of the kind of bugs that thrive in an anaerobic environment. And that can just turn your compost to an unpleasant, stinky mess. So that's one thing I would avoid. But it's not the plants, it's the bugs that's on it. So hay can work quite well, whereas spoiled silage, no.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Audrey. Thank you very much to everybody who attended this evening and for your time and for your excellent questions. If you think of anything else afterwards, which is what I usually do, then do just drop us an email and I'll pass it on to Audrey and we'll get your questions answered. And remember as well that there's the FAS helpline and then there's a FAS website and there's lots of resources on that, and there are some publications that Audrey has written, some guides that are there too. So we'll send out a link along with the survey to so you can get to them easily, and we'll also send you a copy of the presentation too. So thank you very much for your attention this evening, everybody, and hope to see you again. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Bye now.